So we don't. We refuse to fight back. We refuse to argue. We avoid arguing. That's one of the core kind of principles of motivational interviewing. But we also don't judge or criticize or blame. Why? Well, you can hearken back to how important the therapeutic rapport or the alliance is, and certainly judging or criticizing or blaming a heavily ambivalent client who's already probably carrying a fair amount of shame for being stuck in whatever addictive behavior that they're in. Feeling judged, feeling criticized, feeling blamed does not help with the therapeutic alliance, and so we refuse to do that as well. Warning about negative consequences. What's wrong with that? Well, you can understand that that's a form of arguing for change. And again, if we have an ambivalent person, highly ambivalent, we don't lead with the argument for change, because the predictable response will be the person will argue against change. And that's not what we want to do. We want to get the person to be saying the change talk. And you don't do that, we don't do that by arguing for change. We also, there's a caution here about not analyzing or interpreting underlying, reasons for using, right? At some point in terms of problem solving and coming up with other strategies to get legitimate core needs met, that's a fruitful, discussion to have. But in the heat of trying to manage resistant behavior on the part of a client, that tends not to be useful. A client can feel really like that's really invasive, psychoanalyzing them and their motives and everything, and that's not what needs to be resolved. The first order of business there is to back up and match back up with the pace and the place that our client is at in order to bring the resistance down so that fruitful forward progress can occur. And that's not well served by overanalyzing things in that sort of situation. We already talked about confronting, and certainly, not using sarcasm or incredulity, like, you're kidding me, right? You mean that you've lost your family, all your money, your house, and you're still not motivated to kick your habit? What's wrong with you, right? That's the either spoken or unspoken kind of takeaway from that kind of a response. So, we avoid that. So if we're working with a resistant person, and it can be challenging because some folks who present in this way, some very highly ambivalent folks, they do want to pick a fight with you. They do want to distract the focus to be over here somewhere. They'd rather power struggle with you than reckon with the true nature of their core problem, which is this addictive disorder that they cannot overcome or haven't been able to overcome by themselves so far. And so we don't want to fall into those traps like we talked about last time. And that's worth just briefly revisiting the drama triangle, right? We don't want to fall into these traps. And with the aggressive resistant client, we might feel confronted, or if the client's coming across really strongly, we might feel like they're kind of in that persecutory role on the drama triangle, and we can feel almost victimized at times by the person's strong negative emotion and their lack of gratitude for our attempts to help them, and so on and so forth. If somebody's being passively resistant, we may be aware that we're not really reaching them very well, but we may, fall into kind of a rescuer position and try to really, kind of compel them to engage, compel them to get involved, compel them to get active in their treatment efforts or recovery efforts on their own behalf. And that doesn't, work well either. So we need to be mindful of the risks posed by the drama triangle and stay off the drama triangle to the extent possible. So what do we do? Well, thankfully there are some things to do that work reasonably well. And they have to do in motivation interviewing with using some of the techniques and strategies that we've talked about that we're going to kind of elaborate upon here over the next little while. So reflective listening is a wonderful tool to have when you're interacting with somebody who's operating from this resistant or discordant kind of a place. Because reflective listening, as we've covered last time, is not making up anything new. It's feeding back to the client in the form of a reflective statement content that they've already given you. So it's pretty difficult to race ahead of the client when the only thing you're really doing is feeding back to the client what they're telling you. The other things, as we talked about last time, that are very good about reflective listening is that the person feels affirmed, they feel validated. If we're being good reflective listeners, the person will understand that, yeah, we get where they're coming from, right? And reflective statements back to them can serve the purpose of building the alliance, strengthening the therapeutic rapport, because that person feels validated and affirmed, and yes, this person gets where I'm coming from, and yes, they understand, that the struggle that I'm having with my addictive disorder is significant, and that it's not easy, and all those kinds of things. So that by itself is a point gained, right? If somebody feels validated and affirmed, then that's only going to strengthen the therapeutic rapport and give us more leverage to help guide that person out of their ambivalence. So that's of benefit right there. But there's also some very skillful, strategic ways to use reflective listening that we'll touch on here that can help tilt the ambivalence, right? The ambivalence is like a seesaw. You got the argument for change, the argument against change. Some of the reflective listening techniques are subtly but effectively designed to tip that balance away from the argument against change in the direction of the argument for change, and we'll look at that here. So just by quick review, we talked a little bit about simple reflections, but because reflective listening is such a critical element in motivational interviewing, motivational enhancement techniques, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just elaborating upon simple reflections. And really, as was said before, we're holding up a mirror to our client. That's the goal. We hear what they say, but in a simple reflection, we feed them back pretty much as close to, accuracy speaking, as close to what they told us we're telling back to them. We don't want to use the same language necessarily, because that can come across like we're mimicking or parroting or mocking, them. But we want to pick different words, but, reflect back in a statement form what it is that we've heard, right? So we can rephrase it, change up the order of the words. We can use our own words, paraphrase. Those are good kind of habits to get into when we're doing reflective listening to avoid that risk of just sounding like we're mimicking or mocking the person. And as we stated multiple times already, good reflective listening communicates interest and attention to the person and can bring down defenses and strengthen therapeutic rapport. So your client shows up and says, I'm not happy about being here, and I really don't think I need substance abuse counseling. Okay, a simple reflection, being here wasn't your idea, right? You didn't add anything new, right? You took the person's language, the meaning that you took from it, which most times hopefully is accurate, but if it's not, then we can, apologize and correct as we go, but we reflect it back in the form of a statement. Being here wasn't your idea. And if that person, in making that statement, I'm not happy about being here, was maybe half hoping for you to argue with them so that they could distract off into a power struggle over here and not have to deal with the core issue that really brought them there, you've just neutralized that by your response. You've been validating in your response. You can validate somebody's ambivalence without cheerleading that it's the place to stay, right? Reflectively listening and validating or affirming somebody's ambivalence is not the same thing as endorsing it or saying that that's a great place to continue to be. So simple reflections can be a great way to respond to the person who's coming at us in a potentially resistant, quote unquote, way. But there's also some complex forms of reflection that can get a little bit even more strategic. So let's look at amplified reflections next, okay? There are versions of amplified reflection, so by its very name, you would guess that amplified reflections are taking a basic, simple reflection and amping up something about it. And this is one of the areas where motivational interviewing becomes more directive and strategic in nature. We can either understate or overstate what you think the client is saying at the level of strength that you think they're saying it for a strategic purpose. So for example, if a person says, you know, I don't think I'll ever be able, you know, to quit drinking. An amplified reflection that overstates things might be something like, so it would be impossible for you to ever stop drinking. Okay? You're taking the core kind of meaning of what the client is expressing and you're overstating it. Why are you overstating it, right? What's the strategy in play there? Well, the strategy is you're hoping and you're believing that that client has some ambivalence going on, right? So you hope and you believe that they have both arguments within them, the argument against change and the argument for change. In this case, the argument for continuing to drink and the argument for changing their drinking behavior. And as they're expressing kind of a argument against change, right, it would, you know, this drinking thing is so difficult, I don't know that I'd ever be able to change, okay? That's an argument against change. So what you're taking is you're over-amplifying the argument against change to see if there truly is any ambivalence in your person. And that's what you're hoping for, right? You're hoping that the answer that comes back from your amplification of that argument against change will give you some sense of, well, the person's not 100%, you know, on that side of the argument that change is impossible. So you feed it back with an amped up, you know, kind of level of argument against change, so it would be impossible for you to ever quit your drinking. And what you're hoping to hear back, and if the person has any ambivalence, what you will typically hear back is the person will say something like, well, no, I don't think it would be impossible, I just think it would be difficult, okay? That's change talk, right? You just switched, you're able to help that person flip the type of argument that's coming out of their mouth. Their first statement, it would be really difficult to change. I don't know if I would be able to. That's arguments against change. Nothing you can work with there. You amp it up and you say, well, gosh, it would be impossible for you to change probably. And you do that genuinely, not with sarcasm, not with, you know, tongue-in-cheek, whatever. It has to be genuine in order for it to be effective. But that gives the client a point of reference where they think to themselves, gosh, do I really think it's impossible, or might there be some possibility? And the likelihood of them responding with, well, no, I didn't say it was impossible. I don't think it would be impossible. I just think it would be really hard. Great. That's change talk, right? You've helped that person move their thinking from, oh, hard, hard, hard to not impossible. And then that gives you an opening to explore. Okay, well, if it's not impossible, I wonder what kind of things would need to happen to make it a possibility. And you have a fruitful kind of area of exploration that avoids the conflict, the potential conflict that otherwise would be there if you wanted to argue directly against that person saying, gosh, it would be really difficult. You know, you may be tempted to say something like, well, sure, it's hard, but it's better than dying. Or, yeah, it would be difficult, but, you know, what do you want to do? Keep doing what you're doing? You know, and those are not atypical. I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic in my intonation, but those are not atypical responses that I've heard other, you know, addictions counselors give to their folks. But if the person is ambivalent, that kind of response is an argument for change, and typically what you're going to get back is more resistance. But by doing a skillful amplified reflection, you've been able to kind of check the person's kind of talk against change, their argument against change, and open up a line of inquiry because of what came back out of their mouth. Well, I don't think it would be impossible. Great, that gives you an opening. So what do you think, needs to happen in order to make it possible?